strangely enough, when you write fiction about your life, it's like you change your memories to some extent. So many things that were still slightly painful to me after all these years, the pain really evaporated.
Hello and welcome back to The Third Act. I'm Catherine Fairweather and I couldn't be more excited to introduce former 60s fashion icon turned author, the wonderfully candid and charismatic Penelope Tree. Her enthralling, transportative debut novel, Piece of My Heart, is loosely based on a real-life relationship with photographer David Bailey and dramatises her privileged but dysfunctional upbringing and her life in the eye of the fashion maelstrom, with its eating disorders, excess, parties, rebellions, and the entrenched chauvinism of the 1960s. Penelope, it's so fantastic to see you here. I've been really enjoying I almost call it a memoir, but it's a novel. Though it's quite easy to detect certain personalities that were important in your life in the 60s and 70s. You're such a natural writer. Why haven't you written a novel or a book earlier?
Oh, well, thank you for saying so. I think it's because I didn't really have very much confidence in my ability at all. Various things happened to me when I was sort of in my late teens, early 20s, which the book is sort of about a bit. And yeah, it just made me feel that whatever I would write would be inconsequential. But then I got to the age of sort of 60 or so and suddenly found myself alone after a breakup of a long-term relationship. And I had been playing around with writing a novel and various stories for years. And I just suddenly realized I don't have any more excuses. I've got to do this. And it wasn't easy.
Blood, sweat and tears.
It was blood, sweat and tears, very much. And it was a struggle because I feel that I did leave it a little bit late in terms of just the craft of writing. I thought that I could just sit down and this story would come out. But, it doesn't work like that. You need structure.
Did you do writing courses or?
No, I didn't. I decided that I really wanted to write my own book and not really show it to anybody until it was done, not have any input, and just to try and write what came out from, the core, as it were. And I now regret that because I think I could have done it probably faster and without so much struggle if I'd, given it to other people to read.
But it was a process, wasn't it? Because you were not only writing a story, writing your own story, you were also mining your memories. And it was probably like a form of self-therapy.
That's very true. And when you look back 40 years, 50 years, you see that your memories are not solid at all. They're like shifting sands in many ways, something ungraspable about them. So I had to really come down to what actually really happened to me on the inside. I mean, in an inner sort of way. It's that old adage, you weren't really there if you can remember the 60s. And, I certainly couldn't remember things people said. So what I remember was atmosphere. And what I remember was the atmosphere of certain people and how they made me feel.
Wow.
And that was quite crystal clear to me still.
I felt so protective of you when I was reading that novel. I just felt like just scooping you up out of those pages and wanting partly to shake, but it was like seeing one's young self as well. There's so much resonance there. I don't know, you write so universally also about what it is like to be a woman in a world where people are judging you on your appearance.
Yeah.
Did you try writing as, I'm interested in why you wrote it as a novel. Was that easier than it would have been to write it as a sort of autofiction memoir?
Well, when you write a novel, you have a lot more freedom than you do if you're writing a memoir.
Yeah.
And I wanted the freedom to be able to make composites out of some of the characters. Otherwise, there would have been so many characters if it had been a memoir. Also, I wanted to compress time so that in this coming-of-age novel, there was an actual resolution at the end.
Yes.
I think that's quite important for a coming-of-age novel.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that I was exactly resolved at the age of 23, but my protagonist was. And strangely enough, when you write fiction about your life, it's like you change your memories to some extent. You sort of change the DNA of the memory. So many things that were still slightly painful to me after all these years, the pain really evaporated, and I just saw what that girl went through in a much more compassionate way rather than blaming myself all the time.
Exactly. You forgave that person.
Yeah.
I think that was quite obvious in the book. But, I mean, your own life is so extraordinary that actually, being photographed by Diane Arbus when you were 13 and being discovered at the black and white Truman Capote ball, and the life you led in New York and your extraordinary parents and the benign neglect of your childhood and the privilege. I think that what you say about the narrative that you tell yourself is really important, because that's the sort of prop that we use to move forward. Sometimes we tell ourselves a story and that becomes fact.
So true. Yeah. Well put.
So let's start at the beginning then, this life of privilege. You grew up in England?
No, I grew up in New York. Mm-hmm. And actually, the novel is really a novel in terms of, there are many, many things, including growing up in America, that are different than the novel itself, where, the character grows up solely in England. So my father had to move to America in the sort of late 40s. He had been a MP for Market Harborough in the 30s and during the war. And he left England because he married my mother, who's American and 20 years younger than him. And she was very ambitious, very interested in politics, American politics, and he soon just got very fed up with her obsession with politics and, wanting that kind of social life that goes with it. So he sort of went to live in Barbados and spent more and more time there. So my mother, who had amazing qualities, and especially for the time, she was ambitious and she worked hard, but she was totally unmaternal. So I went to school in New York. I went to a very progressive day school called Dalton. You can kind of do what you wanted there. We had the most incredible teachers. I was really inspired to write and to do drama and sing, play guitar, things like that. And my girlfriend and I had a group together. We went down to Greenwich Village and played in the fountain in Washington Square, all these sort of tragic folk songs. We were like 12 or something, and nobody kind of knew what we were up to. And then my mother found out, and I got sent to boarding school, which was very rigid.
In America?
In America, yeah. And, I was just floundering because they weren't interested in my creative little stories. They were interested in the math SAT being done perfectly so you could get into Harvard. Also, I had this sort of incident on a Greyhound bus where I had a sort of sexual assault thing that happened when I was 13, which I never told anybody about or never even mentioned because I thought it would mean that I'd lose my freedom.
Penelope.
And and it wasn't, I wasn't raped, so that's really important, but it was fairly terrifying. And I did think maybe I might not come out of it alive, sort of thing. God. And it was on a bus where there were other people, but they were at the front of the bus and I was at the back.
Where were you going on a Greyhound bus on your own
I know.
at
I was
13?
going from Boston to Vermont to another friend's boarding school. I had the weekend off, and that's what I did. Anyway, I didn't think too much of it because I think I just compartmentalized the whole incident. And about a year later, floundering at boarding school, where I did have really good friends, but otherwise didn't do well academically, felt like a total failure, and was very unhappy, started getting very depressed. I just stopped eating. And I found that not eating numbed my feelings to the point where,
Classic.
didn't really care about what was happening to me. And then I got let go from the school
Because of that.
after a couple of years because of that, and because I was so unhappy. They just sort of said, well, this doesn't seem to be suiting you. I mean, they weren't terrible people. They were, compassionate. And so for my last year at school, I went to the UN school in New York, which was in a condemned building, but it was just fantastic. And suddenly I started doing well, and my confidence came in. Then that very year, I went to the Black and White Ball with my parents, still totally in denial of the fact that I was sort of starving myself. And I got scouted by Richard Avedon. So the next morning, the phone rang at 9 o'clock in the morning, and there was Mrs. Vreeland on the phone saying, "Darling, Richard Avedon saw you and wants to photograph you. Are you up for it?" And I went like, yes, of course I'm up for it. So the next thing I knew, I was on the white paper modeling for Vogue.
It's an incredible story. It's a Cinderella story.
Yeah, sort of, except it was all based on the fact that, I was not eating and I was kind of basically anorexic. And there are consequences to being anorexic.
Did Diana Vreeland notice that you were too skinny?
No, I always said, this is just, I've lost my puppy fat. This is the way it is, I got very good at, looking
Covering.
like I was eating.
And I suppose back then it wasn't quite such a known problem, was it? Anorexia?
It was hardly known at all.
Yeah.
No.
People didn't talk about it, certainly.
There were other girls at my boarding school who definitely had it, but nobody really could identify, oh, that's anorexia. And bulimia was completely unheard of.
And that was what you were throwing up your food, basically.
I didn't have that till later, but I didn't get that until I was over 18 or 19 or something.
Did you feel cleverer than everybody else because you could fool everybody, or did you feel you were living a kind of lie?
I think I had imposter syndrome when I became a model a bit, because I knew that I wasn't. I mean, people kept pointing out that I wasn't beautiful, that I wasn't pretty, but that I just looked like an alien and had a mystery, and I don't know what they thought, but I knew when I saw other girls and other models that I wasn't, classically beautiful. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to be found out, and this is just a flash in the pan. You become very obsessed with appearance if you're a model, and you just compare yourself to all these other girls. And
you're young, you're 17 or something, you're a fledgling, you don't know anything about anything, and suddenly everyone's judging you on the way you look constantly.
Yeah.
Not great.
Which I don't think is great for anybody.
No. And you were clever, though, you see. Did you have ambitions to write back then, even?
I did have ambitions to write, and I was a big reader because being the only child of my parents, that's what I did growing up. And that was my savior, really.
Reading.
Yep.
Who did you read back then? Can you remember?
I read absolutely everything, from Tintin to Enid Blyton to Truman Capote to Lord of the Flies in 1984, and, of course, Catcher in the Rye and all of J.D. Salinger.
Yeah.
And Lolita.
Yeah.
I read a book by William Burroughs called The Naked Lunch,
Yes,
which
I remember that.
parents discovered and were horrified.
That was a cult book at the time,
Yeah.
wasn't it? Yeah. I found it in my parents' bookshelf too. How fascinating! But that was the beginning of the trajectory, the sort of modelling trajectory. And so, what happened then? You were suddenly scooped up, and you were Flavour of the Year.
Yeah, Flavor of the Year, and still going to school. And I don't know how, much to everybody's absolute surprise, I got into the college of my choice. So that was exciting. Everything kind of was going well. And that summer, I came to London and I worked as a reader in a publishing company as an intern for 3 months. It's a publishing company that doesn't exist anymore called Rupert Hart Davies in Soho. And then I went out every night, dressed totally in Biba's clothes and with the eyelashes on my lower lids, one by one, pasted on every morning. Took me 5 minutes. I don't know what these people in this sort of quite straight office thought. But anyway, so one of the nights I met the editor of Vogue, British Vogue, called B. Miller, who was lovely, but kind of headmistressy. Did you know her? Yeah. And then she said, well, why don't you come in? We'd love to do a story on you. Come in tomorrow. And so in my lunch hour, I went in to see her, and the door was open, and there was this guy sitting cross-legged on the floor looking at contact sheets. And I just had this sort of moment of recognition, seeing him. And he looked at me. I looked at him. He just got up, and we just had this electric moment. Bailey.
Right.
It was Bailey. And a few days later, I was working for him. I knew he was married, so in my mind at the time, absolutely no way that anything could ever happen. But we had this shoot that was very nuanced, let's put it that way. And when my job finished at the end of the summer, I went back to America and started university. And about 3 months later, he just sort of came, he appeared and
Looking
said,
for you.
Yeah.
He reeled you in.
He reeled me.
Gosh.
I knew he would.
You knew he would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As one does.
That sense of electricity was just
too strong.
Too strong.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how you say that you sort of smell people or you feel them.
Yes.
That was obviously very potent for you because you felt your way to him.
Indeed.
And you felt his way to you.
But what I've discovered since then is that just because you have that highly electrical charge around somebody doesn't necessarily mean that jumping into the relationship head first is necessarily the right thing. Just means that there is a very strong connection, which there was.
And are you in London with Bailey at this stage in your life, or are you in New York?
So I was still in New York. Then I went to do the collections with Richard Avedon and Twiggy for American Vogue and in Paris. And Bailey and I got together in Paris when I was just 18. And it was very romantic. It was very special and incredible. He was my first boyfriend. And I think part of the anorexia was fear of becoming a woman, fear of sex and growing up and all of that, which I wasn't really aware of, but I think that's what it was. And, being with him, it sort of transformed that experience. And suddenly I did feel, I am a woman and I am capable of having this intense love relationship. And it was wonderful for a year or so. And then, of course, he is incredibly attractive, was incredibly attractive, and girls who wanted to become models or just amazing women were constantly falling over themselves to be near him. And that was extremely difficult.
Yeah, I bet.
And plus, he could work with other people, but he kind of banned me from working with other photographers. And I took it.
You took it?
Yeah.
And you're still friends?
We're really good friends. Yeah.
So you don't, there's no rancor. You were so young and he was controlling, but you don't blame him. You're in a way grateful that he opened your eyes to this love, passion.
Well, the thing is, it was a very different time. It's almost sort of impossible to imagine what a chauvinistic time the 60s were.
Yeah.
It was kind of like the Stone Age, you know. You got clubbed by this guy and dragged off by your hair, and that was supposed to be kind of romantic, right? Yeah. And
exactly. Although the social mores and boundaries were being busted all over the place, it still was Stone Age. Women were still at the mercy of men.
Yeah, because they were very much in the mode of being in the shadow of men.
Yeah.
And I do feel that has changed a lot with education. Women are a lot better educated than we were at that time. But unfortunately, I think the whole problem of girls being in the thrall of men is still the same.
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I would agree, actually. Tell me why you think it.
Well, I think it because, first of all, something like a quarter of all girls have some sort of eating disorder. And I think that's very much brought on by being very aware of the male gaze, you know, how they appear. It's just sort of almost every girl that you ever meet has some form of body dysmorphia. And I feel that is very much a feminist issue.
I think so. So nothing's really changed, and social media has made it worse.
Much worse.
And the access to pornography. And
absolutely.
Girls still feel they need to look a certain way to attract men. It's so bizarre, isn't it, after all these decades?
Yep.
I know, it's depressing. That is depressing. What about Me Too? Has that not improved the situation for women? That, you know, men are accountable for their bad behaviour now in the way that they weren't in the 60s?
Yes, I think it has helped to a certain extent, except it's very worrying how quite a lot of cases are being overturned now, you know, and even Harvey Weinstein's conviction is being questioned. There are people out there like Andrew Tate and his brother, like odious misogynists.
Absolutely.
And they have such a huge following with teenage boys. And I mean, Trump, and I mean, don't get me started. It's sort of prevalent everywhere. I mean, I think, you know, you do meet wonderful boys who are sensitive and probably much more aware than the boys that I might have met when I was 18. So that's kind of encouraging. But then there is a sort of equal and opposite horrible reaction.
When you were saying that your mother wasn't a great role model as a mother, did you find when you became a mother that it was instinctive? There's no manual, is there?
No.
Was it an eye-opener for you? And did you understand your mother better after being a mother yourself?
Okay, well, that's quite a complicated question, but I will just say that I had never held a baby before I had my daughter. I had never, because being an only child, there were never younger kids around. I didn't play with little kids. I wasn't interested. And so I was terrified when I got pregnant that I'd be a terrible mother, like my mother. And my daughter was born. And, you know, right the way through, honestly, I was just in a state about the whole thing, terrified that something would go wrong or that I wouldn't be able to relate to her. And she was born, and it was a miracle because I was just had this extraordinary, I can't even explain it, but it was just so much love that I couldn't really even contain it. Not that that made me a particularly good mother to begin with, because I didn't know what I was doing. Luckily, her dad had been around a lot of babies, so he helped. But I still feel that that was like the turning point of my life. And she was just the most wonderful child. She's now 44, And she and her brother have been the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. So you were in your early 30s?
I was 30,
30.
when she was born.
And were you
Yeah.
living in Australia then?
I was living in LA, actually. My daughter's father was a musician, and he was the drummer for the Beach Boys, actually.
Was he?
Yes. Only temporarily, because, anyway, that's a story you don't want to probably know about. But
Oh, I do.
well, Dennis Wilson, who was the drummer, one of the Wilson brothers,
Yes.
he was a little bit, shall we say, overwrought, and he
Yes.
tried to put his hand through a plate glass window, and he severed sort of arteries and
Yeah.
God knows what in his wrists. So he had to stop for 2 years, and Ricky, who was my husband, took over for a bit. And then we went to Australia with Paloma, who was very little. And then, unfortunately, I broke up with Ricky, and I had a son with an Australian man.
And Ricky, is he alive still?
Yes, he is.
And you're
we're
still friends?
Very good friends, yes.
As you are with Bailey, as you said, which is amazing to carry these people into later life and not be bitter.
Oh, there's nothing to be bitter about. I mean, bitterness doesn't get you anywhere. And it's really not like that, because you look back and you see it wasn't Bailey's fault, for instance, that things turned out the way it was. It was my psychology just as much as his psychology. The thing is, it was bound to happen. I can't even tell you. The energy was so intense. And I guess it was some sort of karma I had to go through.
What did you take away from that very painful breakup, the end of it, which I don't know if that's reflective of your own life, that, well, in the novel, the breakup coincides with the sort of end of her modelling career and the sort of end of everything, basically, as she sees it at the time. But then she does have an awakening and finds an alternative life through travel and Buddhism.
Yeah.
Is suggested at the end, right?
Well, what happened was, as I said, that there was consequences to eating disorders, which is, in my case, my hormones were completely upside down. I don't know what the word is, but disturbed. I didn't get my period for a long time, and then I became very unhappy with Bailey. But because I sort of lost my identity in the relationship, my center of gravity was in him. And I didn't really have an opinion about anything. I didn't really have my own life going on. So I lost my core, as it were, and also my own kind of unhappiness manifested in an acne attack that was so terrible, and nobody could kind of do anything about it until I finally went to a really great doctor in New York who said it's hormonal and put me on hormones, and within a few days it cleared up, but it left very deep scars in my cheeks, and that meant that I couldn't work anymore as a model. And it also meant that my relationship with Bailey, who sort of cared about how his girlfriends looked more than most people, it was just a really difficult thing for him. And
for you, above all.
Well, God, yeah.
For you. I mean, how cruel to have that thing happen to you as a model.
Yes, but I think also it was, I feel that some deeper part of me actually manifested it.
Yeah. Oh, do you?
I do.
You're
really
punishing
do.
yourself for it.
Maybe punishing, but at the same time, because I couldn't express the anger and the unhappiness that I was feeling, it came out through my skin. It had to come out somehow.
But maybe also the deeper part of yourself emerged as well, because through that trauma, you then explored an alternative life for yourself.
Yeah, I had to learn how to look beyond appearances.
Yeah.
And I had to learn how, what it was that was really important to me.
The hard way you learned.
Yeah.
The very hard way.
Hard way, yep.
But when you look at your life, and now you're 70?
70, nearly 5.
Are you? My
Yeah,
goodness.
in December.
Do you enjoy being older?
I really do enjoy being older. I mean, it's a bit of a shock to look into the mirror and sometimes you go, oh, God. But I feel so much more myself and more confident. Also, I have friends of all ages. I feel like that's an enormous boon.
Yeah.
I'm interested in all kinds of different things, and I just enjoy life a lot because, you sort of realize that life is fragile. And, the more people around one that are not doing so well, older friends, etc. And, well, you realize that you don't have forever, so you might as well live, as much as you can, as fully as you can, deeply as you can.
So what gets you up in the morning?
A lot of coffee. I'm not that great in the morning, to tell you the truth. I quite like taking the mornings a bit slowly, but I write a journal every day. And it's sort of very much based on Julia Cameron's idea of you just write 3 pages without taking your pen off the page. And it's extraordinary what comes out, actually. Things you never would know that you were actually thinking about. And I was listening to your podcast with Michael Palin, and he was talking about keeping a journal every morning, but he was obviously thinking so much about what he did the night before and what somebody said, or, it was sort of literal journal. But I try to
just let it all spew out.
Yes. I think it's a really good way to get ideas happening.
What about the fitness and the eating? Are they still part of your something that you think about all the time?
Well, I think that's actually a quite important thing to cover. I was actually cured from anorexia and bulimia when I was 36 via therapy. And I had done a lot of therapy. So I didn't just walk into an office and everything sort of vanished. I had done a lot of work, and what
a relief. It must have been great.
Huge relief.
Not a slave to what you eat and don't eat.
Exactly. It's a huge relief. I mean, this friend of mine's mother used to say, the highest form of happiness is relief. I think that's so true. So that is not so much an issue, although I try to eat healthily. I also try and have a Magnum every day if I can possibly.
I love that. Good.
A Magnum a day keeps the doctor away.
Very, very good. That's
Don't you think?
Best advice I've heard for older age. I love that. But this new act, this third act of yours, this ability to write, is it going to unleash a whole new career, do you think, as an author?
I hope so. I really want to write another novel. And not necessarily all about me this time. But I love, the reason I love novels so much is that, you can really get into the head of somebody that you might not know otherwise. And so I'd quite like to be able to do that from the writer's perspective as well. Inhabit somebody else's voice and thoughts. It would be really interesting.
And you've had some great reviews, haven't you?
Thank you.
So that must be such a sort of validation as well, in the sense that it took you a long time, but you got there in the end. And sometimes, for some people, it's just a little bit harder than for others. That doesn't make it any less valid. I just love the fact that it's because I want to write a novel too, and I am 60 and I haven't done it yet. So maybe there's hope for me.
I'm sure you could write a fantastic novel. Yeah, I have no doubt about that. It's just, I think one of the things that was a problem for me is that every time you read another novel, you think, oh God, I'll never be able to write as well as that. But honestly, sort of completing something like a piece of work like that does actually shift your consciousness a bit. I don't want to be pretentious about it, but it has changed the way that I feel about myself. And that's been a really great thing. I don't know whether it'll last. Maybe it's just a sort of Band-Aid thing.
But you can feel you can do that, and you can do practically anything.
Well, I felt that I really enjoyed the writing process, although I hated it at the same time. It's sort of, yeah. But at the same time, it's fulfilling if you can write a paragraph and at the end of the day, you still like that paragraph. Very rare, I know, but also you can have terrible despair from writing as well, and you have to keep your pecker up.
If you were, I sometimes ask people what if they were writing an epitaph for themselves, what they would say, what they would like it to be. Have you ever thought about that?
I have, and unfortunately I don't feel like I could better Dorothy Parker, whose epitaph literally is "Excuse my dust." It's on her gravestone.
Wonderful. I didn't know that, actually. Excuse my dust. Well, thank you so much. It's been a delight talking to you, and I can't wait to read your next novel.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. I can't wait to read your novel.
My first one.
Yeah.
I'll try.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. If you've enjoyed listening to today's show, you can hear more episodes by clicking follow or subscribe wherever you're listening to this, or by looking for the Third Act podcast in your favourite search engine. This episode was produced by Pete Norton and made possible by Orions, luxurious residences that are redefining later living in the heart of Chelsea. I'm Catherine Fairweather, and you've been listening to The Third Act.